Rebonjour. La session sera en anglais, donc c'est une transition linguistique qu'on propose ici. So welcome to this session on ethics and subjects for and through technologies. Some of the topics that we will encounter with Michael Livermore and Henrik Sætra connect to some tendencies that we noticed yesterday already with this move from a standard approach that used to contrast human subjects and technological tools and ask how can we do something with these tools to make that ethical, to a situation where we see humans and technologies much more integrated, and where we have a notion of subjectivities that are more complex and hybrid, and forms of integration and augmentations where the machine augments the human and the human augments the machine. There have been different moves in this direction yesterday already, so it will be very interesting to see what happens now. So we will start with Michael Livermore from University of Virginia, who has been also specifically working on this aspect from the point of view of the mutual augmentation somehow of law, typical human practice in some way, and data processing with data processing techniques used not just to understand more how law works, but also to change in a way our perception of how legal concepts travel and structure legal practices and institutions. So Mike, you have the floor.
Great, fantastic. Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and the conversation so far has been really super interesting, and illuminating. Maybe I'll just provide a little bit of background on kind of my work to introduce this. So this is going to be a somewhat more abstract talk, and so kind of two pieces of work that I have in my portfolio. One is kind of what was just mentioned, the work on using natural language processing, machine learning, and kind of other tools like this to study the law and legal institutions. And then, and that has kind of, so that's kind of one side of my work. And then another side of my work is actually in environmental law and regulation, and kind of the oversight of the economy and regulatory institutions. And in that domain, I kind of have an interest in environmental law and economics, and the intersection of environmental law, economics, and ethics. And so in the kind of recent work that I'll be talking a little about here, I kind of bring those two worlds together, and thinking kind of very, very generally, and so this is just, again, to kind of frame the discussion, thinking very generally about what are the kind of foundational moral values that are at stake in regulating the environment, in thinking about things like rights for nature, which has been a kind of a conversation in the global environmental movement for a couple of decades now, and how this intersects with technology as well, and new technologies. So I'm going to be focusing less on kind of what's happening in our society right now vis-a-vis certain kind of technologies like large language models, and thinking more about what are the kind of fundamental values at stake, especially for kind of technologies that are somewhat on the horizon. But also, and then the kind of final framing thing is how, is there a way that we can think productively about kind of non-humans more generally, and more morality and ethics as it extends to non-humans, both in the domain of environment and nature, and in the domain of kind of artificial things. Okay. So that is the kind of a little bit of framing. Just want to make sure I stay on time here. So, okay. So in the talk that I'll give today, I'm just going to try to make three basic points. So one is that the world is teeming with subjectivity. Okay, that's one point that I'll make. Hopefully I'll be able to convince you of that. Two, the point I'll make is that this is a good thing. In some sense, this is going to be the core of the claim that I will make, that it is good that the world is teeming with subjectivity. The third claim that I will say, kind of make out a little bit, is that we will soon, now soon being a relative term, so soon could be in a year, probably not, soon could be in 100 years, in the course of human history, certainly in the course of time, that new subjectivities are at least potentially on the horizon. I kind of think they're almost inevitable. And then we can kind of interrogate that with the framework that I offer. Okay, so the world is teeming with subjectivity. So illustration of a bee here. And so what do I mean by subjectivity in this sense? How am I going to use that term? So one, it's very classic, comes from Nagel. The idea of subjectivity is when an entity in the world, when it feels like something to be that entity. Okay, it feels like something. So does it feel like something to be you? Yes, it feels like something to be you. I can confirm that it feels like something to be me. It is very likely that subjectivity is not just limited to human beings, that it feels like something to be a bat. That, of course, was Thomas Nagel's famous argument, or his example that he uses. There's open questions about whether it feels like something to be a bee. Okay? We know that it doesn't feel, we have very little reason to think it feels like anything to be a chair, right? Or a chunk of concrete or an inanimate object like that. Okay? So the idea is that subjectivity is when it feels like something to be that thing. Another way of saying that is that the entity has an inner perspective on the world. Okay? It represents the world in some way and has a perspective on that. Okay, so when I say the world's teeming with subjectivity, so there's there's kind of a couple different ways we can think about that. So one is within human beings, there's many people that have lots of different types of subjectivity. There's a lot of diversity within the human experience. And the claim is that, which is kind of, I think, quite widely agreed to, is that within the world of animals, there's many different kinds of subjectivities. Many animals have subjectivity. Many animals have, an inner experience. It feels like something to be them. And then another piece of this is there's a great diversity of subjectivities, that there's many different kinds of ways of experiencing the world that we see in the animal kingdom. So whatever it feels like to be a bee, is very different than what it feels like to be you and me, okay? And what it feels like to be an elephant is different from what it feels like to be you and me. And what it feels like to be, and then within the human community as well, what it feels like to be, someone that, to be us maybe feels different from someone that is in a different culture. Okay, so that's one claim. Probably all not that controversial, and probably we would all kind of agree with that basic empirical claim about how the world is, that there is such a thing as subjectivity, that there's a lot of it in the world. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to try to convince you of is that this is a good thing, that there is many different kinds of subjectivities in the world. Okay. So the view I'm going to espouse here is something I call heteric welfarism, which is the view that the diversity of subjective experience has foundational moral value. Okay, so that's the core claim. Now, what do I mean by this? So there's lots of different reasons that we might have for valuing things. We can have aesthetic reasons for valuing things. We can have what are called perfectionist reasons for valuing things. But there's a special class of reasons that we have for valuing things, which are moral reasons, okay? So then the question becomes, what are the things that have that kind of moral status, where we have a moral reason to value these things, okay, and value their interests? And a fairly standard account would be that what we have reason to value is things that have well-being, and that the things that have well-being are things that have subjectivity. So when you have an internal perspective, when it feels like something to be you, we can talk sensibly about you having well-being, and for that reason that you have, or that an entity has well-being, that gives me a kind of very strong foundational moral reason to value what is good for and bad for you. Okay, so what we might do here is I want to contrast this with a view like, say, that might underlie nature's rights. So the idea of nature's rights is that, and which has kind of been adopted in constitutions around the world. There's talk in France, actually, of adopting nature's rights in the Constitution. And so the idea is that we would give legal rights to natural entities, things like ecosystems, species, even nature itself. And that's actually been put in constitutions. So the Ecuadorian Constitution in 2008 was the first constitution to adopt an idea of nature's rights. And so one reason that we might have for recognizing nature's rights, so we could do it out of convenience, so that's one reason we might have nature's rights. But many nature's rights advocates argue that the reason we ought to include nature's rights in a constitution or vindicate nature's rights in some way in our legal system is because an ecosystem and species and nature really have interests, intrinsic value, that we have moral reason to care about. So when a species goes out of existence, for example, the claim would be that we've done something really morally wrong, that the causing the extinction of a species is a moral wrong. Just the same way that if you harm people, in some sense, that people have interests, and if you harm those people, that's bad. Ditto with respect to with an endangered species. Now, what is Now, that view, the nature's rights view that I just offered, conflicts with this kind of notion of welfare that I just described, right? Now, why is that? Well, the reason that there's conflict there is because species and ecosystems don't have subjective experience, okay? So the idea is that for that reason, because they don't have subjective experience, they don't have well-being and they don't have the kinds of interests that we have moral reasons to care about. Okay, so that's the conflict between the kind of ecocentric or nature's rights view, where we give moral status to ecosystems and species, and a welfarist view that's grounded in subjective experience. So that's the conflict. So what heteric welfarism does is it provides a way for us to kind of recognize some of the moral intuitions that might ground ecocentrism or nature's rights. It provides a way to kind of recognize some of those intuitions without forcing us to have recourse to kind of what we might call spooky entities like ecosystems and species. We don't have to say, oh, species have their own interests, and maybe even imagine that they have some subjectivity, which they kind of clearly do not. And so what we get with heteric welfarism is the statement that, it is bad, actually, when a species goes extinct. That is actually a moral bad. But the reason is not because the species has its own, or ecosystems or whatever, has its own separate foundational moral value, or its own interest that we are kind of morally obligated to respect. Instead, the reason that we have for, the moral reason we have for evaluating a world in which a species goes extinct or an ecosystem is destroyed, the reason we have for evaluating that negatively is because there is less diversity of subjective experience as a consequence of that extinction, or as a consequence of an ecosystem going out of existence, okay? So it's not the interest of the ecosystem or the species itself that we have a moral kind of obligation to, but rather the world is less good from the perspective of welfare because there's less diversity of subjective experience. Okay, so a question that you might immediately ask if you are, this claim will just land differently with people. So I might say, okay, diversity of subjective experience is foundational moral value. One can either say, oh, that strikes me as somewhat intuitive, or others can just say, that doesn't strike me as particularly intuitive. And so can I provide any further justification for why one might adopt the view that the diversity of subjective experience has foundational moral value? One reason is, well, it can vindicate some of these intuitions that we have about species and extinctions, without making recourse to spooky things like the interests of a species. So that's good. That counts, I think, as a reason to adopt this view. But let me offer a slightly kind of more fully articulated reason. So Okay, so within welfarism, again, what matters is well-being, or we have reason to value the well-being of others. And normally we can think of this as having two dimensions to it, okay? So one is an intensive dimension, and the other is an extensive dimension. Let me just offer a little parentheses here. One of the reasons why I'm kind of so focused on welfarism as a moral framework, there are other moral frameworks, is that welfarism is the moral framework that undergirds normative economics. Okay? So it's a mode of analyzing policy that's used by governments around the world. It's especially influential in the United States. So this is a little bit of motivation. Okay? So welfare economics, normative economics is a very powerful tool of policy analysis. It's a very powerful tool in legal systems. And so, thinking clearly about welfarism is a way of influencing ultimately how we think about public policy questions, say environmental questions, in the real world. So it's not, so yes, this is quite a kind of abstract and philosophical discussion, but it is actually grounded in real world ways of making decisions by governments, consequential decisions, like how much should we address climate change? Okay, so just closing the parentheses. Now, so we normally think within welfarism, one way we can think about worlds being better or worse, or there being more or less welfare, is along intensive and extensive margins. So the intensive margin is like the average amount of welfare that a group of people have, you can say. Let's just stick with people for the time being. That would be the classic, anthropocentric, human-oriented welfarism. So start there. We can say whatever the population is, worlds are better. It's often how people talk in this domain. Worlds are better when people are better off. When however many people you have, when the average level of happiness is greater, that's good. It's good when people are happier by their own lights. That's usually what we mean by welfare, is that people, they take their lives to be going better. Okay, so that's the intensive margin. Whatever the population is, whatever the group of people that we're talking about, worlds are better, things are better when their lives go better. Okay, when average welfare is greater. So that's one margin that we can think of. Almost everyone agrees with that. Okay, it's very difficult to argue against the view. If I make it's a very uncontroversial claim that worlds are better when people's lives are going better. Okay, almost everyone would agree with that, and I would argue everyone probably should agree with that. Okay, so there might be we can say there might be exceptions, and so on and so forth, but others, let's say other things being equal, then we would certainly be pretty much stuck with that. Okay, another thing that welfarists care about is the distribution of well-being over persons. Okay, so where generally speaking, so fairness, right? So worlds where there's a more equal or a more fair distribution of well-being over persons are preferred over worlds where there's less fair distributions, where wealth or welfare is concentrated in a small number of people. So many welfarists will hold the view that equality is important, has foundational moral importance. Okay. So both the intensive margin and then the distributional question exists within the domain of a fixed population. Okay, we're just saying, given who's out there, we care about their interests and we want their lives to go better, and we prefer more fair distributions. Okay, so then there's a second margin that we can also attend to, which is the extensive margin. All right. Now the extensive margin classically is understood in terms of population size, all right? So the idea here is that worlds that have more population are better than worlds that have a smaller population. Now this is can immediately trigger some kind of like negative responses, right? Because you say, well, there's too many people. It's bad for the environment if there's so many people, or something like that, right? So normally, when you're kind of thinking in this philosophical style, you would say, okay, well, other things being equal, right? So we're going to add someone to the world, and it's not going to be bad for anybody else. It's not going to take up too many resources. It's just going to be, there's a world, there's our world, and there's another world where there's just like one more happy person in it, right? And so if we attend to that extensive margin, then we would say that is better. It is better to add a single happy person to the world when there are no negative effects. All we're doing is adding a single happy person, okay? So if you hold that view, which again is, I think, highly, highly plausible, and if you don't hold the view, you run into some weird issues. I will say you also do run into some weird issues when you hold this view. This is how philosophy works, moral philosophy, is that you're always going to have some problems. But in any case, if you do hold that view, which is quite strongly intuitive, then you are attending to the extensive margin of well-being, right? You're saying that, when there is a more well-being, right, in the world, so more experiencing subjects, as long as those experiencing subjects are sufficiently happy, then you're attending to the extensive margin. And so this is classic welfarism that goes back to like Bentham or whatever. Like this is not, what I've just offered is just old hat. So there's just the three things. There's average well-being, how well lives are going for the people who exist, the distribution of well-being over persons, so fairness, and then the total amount of well-being. Okay, so this is very classic. So what I'm adding here is to say, to this classic formulation, I'm adding worlds are better when there's more diversity of subjective experience. Okay? Now, how does that fit in with the classic conception? Well, I think it fits in as another dimension of the extensive margin of value. Okay? So if we think that it is the case that worlds, when there are more experiencing subjects, are better because there's more welfare, there's another way in which there can be more welfare, which is that there's more diversity of subjective experience. Okay? So there's numerosity, and that's one of the extensive margins that we might attend to in terms of well-being. And then there's diversity, which is another extensive margin, which tells us about the extent of well-being. Okay. So that's kind of a slightly deeper claim. I'll just add a little bit more motivation. Maybe everyone's fully convinced, but I'll just add a little bit more motivation, which I think kind of goes to our moral sentiments a little bit, which is that concern with the intensive margin, right? So wanting lives to go as well as possible for the people who exist, or the subjectivities that exist, to be non-anthropocentric about it, is a manifestation of compassion, right? That's an attitude that we have towards others. We recognize the interiority, we recognize the realness of other people's experiences, and we then respond to that naturally with compassion, which is to say we want their lives to go well. Okay? So that's tying this, this way of valuing to a moral sentiment. And what I kind of argue is that concern with the extent of population, we can tie also to a separate moral sentiment, which is one of affirmation. Right? We're saying that it is good that there are experiences. It is good that there is more of experiences, more in the sense of more subjectivities in the world, having experiences, and more in the sense of more different kinds of experiences that are being experienced in the world. Okay? So intensive margin is a response of compassion. Fairness, obviously, or justice, distribution is a response of fairness. That's the moral sentiment. And then extensive margin, diversity, and numerosity are manifestations of the moral sentiment of affirmation. Okay? Life affirming or experience affirming. Okay, so maybe I've convinced some folks that it is good that there are lots of different types of experiencing subjects in the world. Now, I came to this question in the context of nature's rights and environmental law and ethics. What I was trying to do is think about, within the framework of welfarism, which undergirds economics, is there a way to vindicate some of the intuitions that drive environmental ethics, views like ecocentrism or nature's rights, without having to bite the bullet and accept that like ecosystems have their own separate interests. And so that's where I kind of came to these questions. And so we might ask, well, does any of this have to do with AI? Which is a fair question. But one of the heteric welfarism doesn't really recover a full conservation ethic because a lot of the conservation ethic is oriented towards conserving the status quo or imagining a world free of human influence and specially privileging organisms that would exist in a world free of human interest. And heteric welfarism is agnostic about that. So it just says any kind of diversity of subjective experience is good. So, so this is an empirical claim. It's a prediction. And like I said, soon is a term that can have lots of meaning in geological time, right? Soon means something very different than in the course of my lifetime. And I'm being vague about what I mean by soon here. But in the course of human development, the claim is that we will create new subjectivities. Frankly, personally, I don't think it's that far away. But I don't want to, who knows? Who knows what the future holds, right? As noted, Putin could start dropping bombs on the rest of the world, and that would set us back a little bit in our technological development. 5 minutes. Okay, great. So, this is just a paper that was in Neuron in 2022. The technology, which has been around for 20 years, I think almost, or 15 years, is they denature a bunch of mouse neurons and actually human neurons in different experiments. They put them on an array of you have a kind of an electrode array, and then they train the kind of neuron electrode hybrid to play a video game, okay? And it does very well, can play the video game quite well. And the claim that they make in the paper is that this thing that they've created, a brain in a dish, has sentience. Actually, that's a controversial claim, but the point that I want to make is just that, that's the kind of thing that is on the road to building artificial subjectivities. And there is research in synthetic biology, research in, obviously, artificial intelligence, all kind of point in the potential direction of subjectivity. Now, one of the things I want to make very clear is I'm not talking about ChatGPT being like like an agent or something, like having subjective experience. That's not the claim. It's got nothing to do with large language models. It's more about the kind of computational capacity that we have constructed in certain, computers. The OLC5 in Oak Ridge Laboratory, for example, apparently has roughly the computing power of one human brain, which is quite something. And then ChatGPT itself, even though all it's doing is processing language, there's still a lot of parameters in that model. It's a very big computational model. So it's not like it's like has human cognition or something like that. That's an illusion that people might have, but it's got a lot of computational power, and so the question is whether the research agenda really hasn't been to build out subjectivity. There is research on subjectivity. There are folks who are very interested in this, and so the claim is that at some point in the future we will construct new subjectivities, either purely artificial, through something like synthetic biology, or through some kind of hybrid biotechnical invention. So, final question to ask us with. Is this a good thing? Is it good that we might create these artificial subjectivities? Would it be good? Okay? And so there are just some questions that I'll kind of leave us with that we can discuss. So one is, will we know it when we see it? Will we know when how do we know? I just made the claim that this thing, with the brain, with the neurons in the dish, doesn't have subjective experience. I don't think it does, but it's obviously I can make an argument. But what kind of criteria should we use? We already face very difficult questions of understanding what in the biological world has subjectivity, right? People argue about whether bees have subjectivity. Some argue whether plants have subjectivity, right? And so that is, and all of those hard problems that we face around drawing dividing lines around subjectivity that we have in the natural world are just compounded in the synthetic artificial world. It's very hard. It will be very hard for us to know whether we have created something that has true subjectivity. Now, some other final kind of what I would call kind of moral considerations. These artificial subjectivities could vastly expand the experiential landscape. So if we think it is good that there's a diversity of subjective experience in the world, then these kinds of entities that we might create would be very, very good in that sense. It could, because our subjective experience is quite different from a humpback whale's subjective experience, which is quite different from a bat's subjective experience. But all of us, animals, are, in some sense, very similar to each other compared to a truly artificial subjectivity that would exist on a silicon chip or in a biological hybrid thing, and would be designed, it would have an entirely different, it would be a rupture in evolutionary history in some sense. It would be a very, very, very different kind of thing. So it could vastly expand the experiential landscape. And for that reason, it would be good. Now, all this would come with risks, and we should be mindful of those risks. But the idea here is just that if we think diversity of subjective experience is good, that provides us with a reason that can be defeated by other reasons, but still with a reason to pursue a research agenda along these lines. A question that I think is quite interesting, that I think this raises, is the prospect of subjectivity without well-being. What would that mean? You're not going to find that in biology, because things that evolve have kind of base interests that come out of evolution, whereas we could potentially design subjectivities that were like indifferent to its own well-being or something like that, which I think is a kind of interesting kind of prospect. And should we care about something like that, and what would it mean to care about something like that? And then the final set of questions that kind of are raised are, do we owe special obligations to human creations? If we create something that has subjective experience, does that create a special class of obligations that we don't have to things in the world right now? So, like bees are a good example. If we think that bees have subjective experience, that might give us that does give us a reason to care about the well-being of bees, but at least kind of, if you look at our current world, we don't care very much about them, right? We don't care very much about insects. We actually don't care very much about a lot of birds, a lot of mammals. So we don't seem to have very strong felt obligations towards a lot of entities that have subjective experience. Although, obviously some people feel more felt obligations than others. And so one question would just be, would we have like very special kinds of obligations to these new kinds of entities because they kind of came out of human agency rather than just kind of evolving in the course of history? And if we do, what are those obligations? Would we be obligated to create them? Would we be obligated to not create them? Would we have to be assure ourselves of them having some kind of passing some kind of threshold of happiness, whatever that would mean? I think those are the kinds of questions that we might face. But again, I'll just close with the answer to, is this a good thing with heteric welfarism? We don't know the answer to that, right? It's just that diversity of subjective experience would provide us a reason to think that it is a good thing that could be outweighed by other reasons. Okay, that's my talk.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 15 minutes of questions. I'll just kick off while people are getting ready by asking you what you would say to someone telling you, okay, but what if the importance of this diversity is just actually a proxy for the importance of the biodiversity, so the importance of each of these bits of these organisms for an ecosystem, rather than the individual value of them having this experience, and how this would cut the analogy with the artificial side.
Great. Well, thanks very much. So, so it's an interesting question. So one point that is absolutely true is that biodiversity, or ecosystems and species and so on, have a lot of utility for human beings, right? There's anthropocentric reasons to care about these things. One, because they contribute to a stable world, a stable biosphere that we live in, right? Bees, obviously, are important for pollination. They provide ecosystem services. That's how a lot of economists would talk about this. Now, and that provides a reason to care about the environment, a great reason to care about the environment, actually, to do a lot more environmental protection than we, in fact, do. Okay, so that's true. So I think there's a kind of a practical, pragmatic thing that would just say, well, if that's the case, we have these instrumental reasons to preserve biodiversity, who cares about these moral foundational stuff, right? Which I think is kind of fair, to be honest. At the other hand, a lot of environmentalists and environmental ethicists can kind of insist that there are non-human reasons, non-anthropocentric reasons to care about species and ecosystems or whatever else. And, I want to have an answer for them. Also, we might pursue different policies, right? Like, if all we care about as human interests, there are species that do not matter. Now, some people will disagree with that. I think they're being a little. I don't know that there are species that do not contribute much to ecosystem stability. When a species is eliminated, other species quickly come in and fill the niches. People don't care. There's no magical drug that's going to come out of these species. They're very low probability. So, and maybe it's very costly to conserve the species. One thing I'll just note is often a contrast that I'll draw is, it's not costless to conserve species. Now, often we might say, well, look, it's just like human consumption that's on the other side, and we don't care about human consumption very much, which is nice for us to say here, of course, in comfortable surroundings, but there are folks that consume much less. But one of the things we actually often have to do in conservation is kill lots of animals. Right? So it's like what you do in conservation is kill animals. If anyone has a garden, you know that what you do with a garden is you kill things. You don't grow things, you kill the weeds that are trying to kill the things that you want to grow, right? And so that's the same thing. Like in New Zealand, they have a lot of endangered birds, and there's a massive campaign to eradicate like millions of rats and possums and moles and other mammals that eat bird eggs. And to do this, you sow poison all over the islands, and they actually die in really horrible ways. So if you care about animal welfare, this should raise some concerns, and then we want to put something on the other side. And if we're just talking about some birds that maybe some people care about, maybe some people don't, that don't really contribute meaningfully to the existing ecosystem, then we really need to have a reason to do this. And arguably diversity, so maybe the bird as a species has an interest that we ought to respect. I find that implausible. It doesn't have subjective experience. And so the diversity of subjective experience that has moral weight that we can set us on the other side of the balance. Doesn't mean it's always justified, but there are kind of reasons to interrogate into this question of the foundation of what's of foundational moral importance, even though very admittedly there are many cases where human instrumental reasons provide absolutely good justification for ecosystems and species protection.
Yes, David Charles. So thank you for this nice talk. I really like the welfarist theory, and I have one remark and one question. First, the remark is, so if we just restrict ourselves to human being, we have to acknowledge that subjectivity of human being is evolving at the individual level through time. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you want to raise welfare of a population, it might well be that the measure you take will change the subjective well-being of several people. Mm-hmm. So this means that the question is not how you raise the welfare of a population, but what measure is compatible with the transformation of the people and the welfare they will approve once the thing has been made. So this is like a fixed point problem, and after you have to choose a fixed point, and then comes into the moral into play. So now. The diversity could be one of the criteria to choose a fixed point. And if you extend with a theoretic welfarism to any entity that is able to some kind of autopoietic systems or self-sustaining things. So now I think that there is something to make more clear for me, because, for example, so I think you will say that you cannot make hierarchies among different kind of subjectivities. So in that case, this means that there is a very easy way to increase a theoretic welfarism. You just focus on bacteria. Mm-hmm. Bacteria, there are many. Say they can reproduce, mutate, they can feel different things. We can create bacteria that are eating plastics, so they have different subjectivities than the other. So this means that one of the goals should be to increase the population of the bacteria. If you have a law like that, this means also that you can condemn the people that are making pesticides because, for example, the glyphosate, they reduce the diversity of gut microbiota. So the question is how you put all these consequences of this position all together.
Yep. Good. So I'll just answer this. I take that the first point is very interesting. Well, I'll just we'll puzzle over that. But with respect to kind of hierarchies and bacteria, so a couple of things. So actually, I have no problem making hierarchies. So I'm actually quite comfortable with the claim that I actually think any moral theory that doesn't vindicate the view that a human being is in some fundamental way more important or more valuable, a human life, than a rat life, since it's just something has gone really afoul of that view, and it would need to be rejected. So that's kind of one thing. So I'm actually kind of perfectly happy to say that entities have different. What I would say is that they have different amounts of subjective experience, and that humans have more, or it's more weighty in some way. Okay, so that's one thing. It doesn't solve the. I'm going to just give a couple answers, but then your problem will still persist. Actually, even if I allow for hierarchies. And then my second thing I'm going to say is I don't think bacteria have subjective experience. And this would get us into the definition of subjective experience, of course. But I really am going to limit subjective experience to animals. Okay, so animals like big macro animals like not just vertebrate though, because octopuses are in there. But having central nervous systems, that kind of stuff, where there's enough information, the kind of collecting sensory information from enough information sources, integrating it enough at a sufficiently highly complex computational level that's going to give rise to subjectivity. Okay, but to take your question, take whatever my minimal entrant is in the world of subjectivity, right? Let's say it's bees or insects. Then we still run into this exact same problem that you just described. It's just that instead of being microscopic, it's very small, right? So now, isn't it the case that under heteric welfarism, what we should do is just maximize the number of bees and insects and stuff, and that might mean that actually the resources that we spend on education or even healthcare, we should just devote to maximizing the number of insects in the world. Okay, so this is actually a version of a very classic problem that is offered by Derek Parfit, and what he calls this is the repugnant conclusion. And any aggregate welfarist has to face the repugnant conclusion, right? The repugnant conclusion is just that what it says is that for any world that has a fixed amount of well-being in it, I can imagine another world that has way more population, but lives that are just barely worth living, and there will be more welfare in that world, okay? And he calls that the repugnant conclusion. He says that's repugnant. We should reject that. But no one has ever figured out a way to preserve, well, that's not true. There are ways of thinking about aggregate welfarism that doesn't run into the repugnant conclusion, but all of them have their own problems too. So for what it's worth, I don't have a solution to the repugnant conclusion either, but that just puts me in good company. But what I do think is that heteric welfarism has something to add to the conversation about the repugnant conclusion, which would be, frankly, I would be proud if that were true. People would buy that. So what I think it has to add is, when we intuitively imagine the repugnant conclusion picture, so Parfit's, let's stick with humans, but we can expand this to other subjectivities without any loss of meaning, but just for purposes of our intuitions. When we picture Parfit's repugnant conclusion, what I think we picture is, a vast world full of people, again, whose lives are just barely worth living. And I believe that intuitively, when we picture that world, we picture a world of sameness. We picture a world of very similar experiences. Because that's not necessary. Doesn't have to be, but I think that's a part of how we intuitively picture the repugnant conclusion world. And I think the same is kind of true and even more so when you take it back to the level of insects, is that these insects are kind of having very stereotyped experiences. Like one bee's experience is pretty similar to another bee's experience. And maybe even bees' experiences aren't that different. Well, bees are quite distinct, but all the different kinds of ant species are kind of similar to each other. And every individual ant is having very similar kinds of experiences. And so if we were to take a world only of insects, it would actually be a world with very little diversity of subjective experience. And that would be bad. And so what diversity of experience does is it sets, there's something else in the ledger, right? There's the total amount of well-being, and there's this conflict maybe between the extensive and the intensive margins, so that the intensive margin can go down as long as the extensive margin gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And what I want to say is there's another dimension to this that we have to keep track of, which is the diversity of subjective experience. And if we have a world with many, many, many entities in it, that could be a world that is very flat in terms of diversity. Now, and this will be the final thing I'll just say on this, because I know we have other folks, is that doesn't solve the problem. All it does is add another dimension to the problem, makes it more complicated. Actually, in some ways, it increases the problem, because what if we imagine worlds that are hyper-diverse, but where there's low average utility? Or maybe it's possible that we could have even more extensive populations that are enough to offset the loss of diversity or whatever. So it doesn't kind of solve the problem, but it does give us room for thinking in more multidimensional ways about how it works.
Great. Yeah. We have 5 minutes for 2 questions lined up.
Okay, great. I'll be quick.
Please, all of you be.
Otherwise
we're really running behind now.
Great. I'll take the both questions and I'll answer them at the same time. Yep.
Thank you for your talk. That was great. So I have a question about the concept of subjectivity, which both historically and if I understand in your conception, is a derivative of the concept of subjects and thus requires individuals. Mm-hmm. And so this individual basis, as you explained, is very useful to make your theory fit. And be useful in the context of economics, law today that are based on individual properties and rights and policy actions that also address individuals. But the difficulty is that it's, I'm not sure how it can account to forms of existence that are not necessarily so individual. So ecosystems, as you mentioned, but if we focus on the case of new forms of intelligence, of AIs, is it really the best description to think about them in a subjective way, in a way that would be similar, although different, to human intelligence?
Great. I'll take the other question and I'll get to that quickly. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for this very interesting paper. Well, it won't surprise you, given our discussion yesterday at dinner, that I would say, cribbing a comment from an analogy from a colleague of mine, that you're sort of a welfarist the way a taxidermist is an animal lover. You like welfarism stuffed and mounted on the wall because I don't see how diversity of subjective experience is sustained by welfarism in your view. It's a very plausible thing to say that it's an object of intrinsic value, but I don't see how a welfarist can believe in it. I mean, you can think that, I certainly see in some of your arguments present a welfarist argument for diversity of species, but that's not necessarily diversity of subjective experience. They may go together, but the subjectivity is not part and parcel of the value from the standpoint of a welfarist, it seems to me. So I think the subjective part is sort of neither here nor there as far as you're concerned, from a standpoint of welfarism. And then as far as the diversity of species, all things considered, I don't see how a welfarist can come out and say this is a good, because as you yourself argued, we don't know what it's up against, right? And there's cost to maintaining it. So it's a sort of plausible a priori good, but even then, one wonders. And all of this goes to say, while I may agree with you, it's more fodder for why I'm not a welfarist. But right. Second quick point. I very much doubt, but I'd love to hear your arguments for why you think we'll create new subjectivities. There I really am not a full-blown materialist on this, and I think that's a whole nother discussion and a fascinating discussion, a good one for this group. So I'd love to hear any thoughts.
Great. So I will be very quick, or are we entirely out of time? But I'll just be I'll be super quick. So subjectivities and individuals, very interesting. I think my quick answer to this is, if an AI, it may be that with lots of kinds of AI, subjectivity is in no way the right way to describe it. It could be very smart, can have other things, it could be doing lots of interesting things, but if it doesn't have the kind of integrated information processing and kind of representation of the external world and, the internal perspective, that it feels like something to be, whatever the entity is, then it doesn't have subjectivity, and I don't think it has any foundational intrinsic value, right? And so that's the linchpin. So it either, in the moral theory, subjectivity is very, very, very important. Things that don't have it just they don't have intrinsic value, so we don't have to worry about them. It comes up if something does have, it might be that, again, tracking the kind of last argument, that we'll never make artificial intelligence to have subjectivity, in which case we have to worry about them as independent, having independent moral value. I think that's how I would kind of think about it. Okay, species, subjective experience, and so on. So what I would just quickly say is, there's some debates about what it means to be a welfarist, and we could kind of think differently about what the stakes of those debates are. So I use a definition from Sumner, which is what he says is that you're a welfarist if what you think matters, has foundational value, is well-being. And that's it. And then you can actually, for him, you can be a deontological welfarist. And so it's not consequentialism, and so I think what matters is well-being. It doesn't require one to be an aggregate welfarist. You can be an average utilitarian. You could care about aggregates or not. These are all just different forms of welfarism. But if one wants to argue that some of them are not welfarism and some of them are just something that's like a close cousin to welfarism, or what I'm describing is an extension of welfarism, I don't know that I'm very worried about that. Okay, so that's one. Two, on species and subjective experience. So I think actually species don't matter. I think what matters is diversity of subjective experience. So if there's two species and they have similar subjective experience, then they just count as one thing. They don't add diversity of the kind that matters, which I think is diversity of subjective experience, which again ties me into being a welfarist, because what I think matters is, okay. And then in terms of the probabilities of new subjectivity, the quick answer that I have there is I'm just a materialist. So I'm substrate neutral, and so I think that anything that happens on a human brain could in principle happen on a silicon chip, and that's just the end of the game. Now, obviously, people who disagree with that, have a whole other kind of set of arguments, but we shall see, I think, is the only thing I can say to that.
So now we'll leave the floor to Henrik Sætra, who's based at the University of Oslo, where he leads the research group on regenerative technologies. Henrik is interested in techno-moral changes and in techno-moral integration, and he has a tendency to investigate classic moral concepts that people try to investigate as human concepts that we try to apply to machines, whereas he actually tries to immediately look into how they work in a hybrid way, in a mix of human and machine interactions. He does this with trust, he does this with ethos, he does this with other moral-related concepts, and it's fascinating to see what's going to happen with politics now. Thank you.
Let's see. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure. I'm a political philosopher by training, so I used to be a political scientist. Nobody would call me that anymore, I think. I don't publish in political science journals, and I work at the Department of Informatics. But anyway, that's where I am. And I'm sorry I don't really speak French, so I haven't really been able to connect my things with all the preceding things. But I've seen a lot of things that I know are very interesting, so I wish I could understand more. Next time, maybe. What I will be talking about is democracy and AI. So I'll be connecting kind of our use of artificial intelligence today with our democracies, democratic values and what democracy is. And I'll be discussing a case, an extreme case of using AI related to what I call political cybernetics. So that's what I'll be discussing, and I'll end with some of the kind of implications of using technologies in the way we are starting to do. Already doing, partially, and also planning to do and wanting to do also. First of all, my research agenda these days is a lot on AI and democracy. There is a lot of attention going to this, but it's a lot of partial attention to kind of isolated issues related to how AI relates to democracy. So what I want to do is a more kind of holistic approach to this, where I look at different levels of impact and different kinds of impact. So we have AI's impact on individuals, for example, how we search for information, gather information, how we process information, and create information. That's connected to democracy clearly, right? So that's one area in which AI obviously has impacts. But also how we relate to others. the way we associate with our fellow citizens and politicians, how we find them, how we communicate with them, and what we see of them. That's also clearly relevant to kind of democratic processes if we believe that interaction and communication is integral to democracy, as I do. Then we have the democratic institutions and policy implementation part of it. Institutionalized forms of political communication, media, voting, engagement, involvement, surveillance, AI in government, policy development, implementation, all of these aspects come into this kind of macro level where we use AI in ways that also impact on democracy as I see it. Finally, we have the global politics, corporations, and ideology part of it, which is beyond the nation state as well. Private power and big tech, multinational corporations, libertarian and technocratic ideas, conflict and allure of techno-fueled libertarianism, for example. So that's kind of one of the broad outlines of what I'm trying to do these days, looking at these levels, across these levels, and seeing kind of what's the overall potential impact of AI, both in terms of what will AI do to our democracies, but also, more importantly, what do we want our democracies to be in the future, and how can AI play a positive role in that? If it can, I think it can, but it's not kind of obvious that it will play a positive role, so we need to be careful in how we use it. Democracy, what does this mean for today's citizens? In Norway, for example, with the friends I have that are not political scientists, they'd be hard-pressed to find kind of a really clear definition of what democracy is and what it means today, other than kind of ruled by the people, for example, these kinds of obvious, broad definitions of it. Everyone knows the concept, and everyone seems to think of it as something good. We need democracy, right? Something democratic is something good. So we kind of tend to just kind of not really engage with the concept, what it means, and to just assume that it's something good. Most people do. Historically, we have examples of people and philosophers, political philosophers, scared of democracy, saying it's a bad thing. Here we have Hobbes, for example. Here we have Plato. Here we have some of the kind of key figures in realism, for example. But this is kind of mainly what people do. And if we come into a situation where people don't really relate to the concept of democracy anymore, don't really see why it's valuable, don't really understand what it means and what it kind of what's needed to preserve it, then I think we're in a situation where AI is positioned to potentially kind of destroy or dilute the concept and the way we do democratic politics. The key questions to ask then, to kind of start answering some of these questions perhaps, is why is it good? If it is good, do we believe it's good? Why? Does it have instrumental value? Is democracy good because it kind of creates and lets us arrive at the best policies? If so, then it has instrumental value. It's good because the outcomes are good. Or does it have intrinsic value? Is there something beyond kind of the best policies that makes democracy valuable? Is there something about this process that makes democracy valuable? Depending on how we answer this, AI has a different role to play and different harms and potential kind of benefits to play. So this depends on kind of what do we mean by democracy, because there are different takes on that. Is democracy about conflict and compromise, competition over votes and this kind of need to compromise? Or is it about everyone trying to find our common kind of the will of the people, our kind of, our joint will, our joint perception of reality, for example. Is that what democracy is about? These are two very, very different perspectives. And AI is positioned to play a role in both. Is it a private and individual phenomenon? I can go vote, but beyond that, kind of politics is no part of my life. Nobody has any business with kind of what I vote and what my political motivations are. As I've voted, I return to being an economic actor, a social actor, but kind of politics is nothing beyond that. Versus politics being kind of integral to social life. What we are as human beings are deeply political. Depending on how you answer that is also very different. And are we consumers, voters, taxpayers, for example, these kinds of kind of thin concepts of political individuals that mainly have rights, that we can kind of argue that our rights are not fulfilled, for example, or are we citizens with some duties as well, some kind of broader conception of what we are as humans? How we answer these questions shape what democracy and AI can do. One article published in Nature Machine Intelligence is called Avoid Diluting Democracy by Algorithms, where we say that there's a tendency among AI researchers to use the concept of democracy and democratization in ways that are only loosely connected to their political and historical meanings. So we argue that it's important to go back to this kind of political theory or kind of democratic theory 101 to see what do we mean by democracy before we start talking about democratic AI, for example, before we go too far in diluting this concept. I think that's important. So we go into three major strands in this article. Democracy as the competition for votes. Schumpeter's position is mainly that kind of democracy is about this process where we kind of compete, or politicians compete for our votes, and then we return to kind of daily life, which is not that political, in the period between elections, for example. So that's a relatively thin concept. Then we have democracy as organized interest as well. Robert Dahl, for example, talks about this kind of a bit broader, more group-oriented form of democracy. But finally, the one that's somewhat interesting here, and most at risk perhaps, most interesting in terms of risk, what is AI doing to democracy as deliberation? Because this is a much, much, much broader and more comprehensive idea of what does it mean to be a democratic citizen? What does it mean to make policy? What does it mean to live in a democracy? It's about deliberation for Habermas, for example. So this is kind of the basis. What we say in this article is that people are writing articles. Google DeepMind, for example, researchers and prominent institutions in the US are writing kind of democratic AI. They're calling their AI systems democratic AI because they make systems that can automatically kind of mine people's preferences and beliefs and then arrive at what the kind of best and most preferred solution is, without people being involved in political process in any way. They can kind of pretty much automate the democratic process and say that this is democratic AI. To me, that's not democratic AI, and that takes us into kind of a sphere where we'll lose most of the process of politics and democracy, which could potentially be bad. The same authors made a system that's involved in finding consensus. So they use AI to, again, kind of mine the interests and kind of mine the preferences of the people involved, and then generate proposals for consensus. And they then said, but we are successful in this. We managed to kind of arrive at proposals for consensus statements that people agree on, more so than if they were involved in actual deliberations to form consensus, right? So what do we think of that process? That's kind of the key question then. Do we think that because objectively people say that, yes, this is closer to my preference, as in kind of this is something I would agree on a consensus basis? Is that the form of consensus we're interested in? Or is there something we lose in the process of automating that kind of hunt for, the really difficult hunt for consensus? Because we are very different. And it's kind of often quite painful to kind of talk to and try to find out what others mean, what others want, and why they want what they do. That's a kind of cumbersome process. It's a painful process. It's really not fun for most people, right? So the kind of allure of using AI to just arrive and skip all that and arrive at the best policies is quite attractive. But we say that in brief, democracy is at least more than majority rule. Leadership, elections, organizations, deliberations, and pluralism are crucial components of it, we say. So associating democracy with majority rule alone dilutes and diminishes democracy as a concept. And that's one of the applications we talk about in this article, where they kind of try to find that kind of what is the solution that most would want for. And they call that democratic AI. And that skips a whole lot more than kind of what we want out of a democracy, we think. And then we take this a bit back to democracy pushback, because democracy is not seen as good by everyone, or at least not kind of intrinsically good, and at least not always good. Critique of citizens and the technocratic alternative, because that's another article I wrote called kind of a shallow defense for a technocracy of AI. Schumpeter says the typical citizen drops down to a lower level of mental performance as soon as he enters the political field. He argues and analyzes in a way which he would readily recognize as infantile within the sphere of his real interests. He becomes primitive again. So kind of most people, kind of the people out there are really, really bad at doing politics for him. Drops down to a lower level of mental performance, which means that we won't really get any good outcomes by involving citizens and people in these kinds of discussions. Schumpeter argues that if we want results that are satisfactory to people at large, and if we judge our governments by such a criterion, government by the people would often fail to meet it, right? So if democracy gives us bad policies because people are bad at doing politics, then why not pursue some other avenue of doing this? And for others as well, this is an attractive kind of way of thinking about politics. Friedrich Hayek, why democracy? He says that democracy is not an ultimate or absolute value. It must be judged by what it will achieve, which again is then kind of what will it achieve? What good will it do for us? Kind of show us the kind of positives here. Then we can say that democracy is good. It's not good in and of itself, he says. Majority decisions tell us what people want at the moment, but not what would be in their interest to want if they were better informed, which opens up for a very paternalistic way of kind of bypassing people's involvement in politics and having some experts decide what would really be best for you. Kind of, you may think you want this, but we know better, right? And that also kind of opens up for bypassing a lot of democratic politics. So those are two representatives of something I call a technocratic tendency, a tendency to bypass this kind of, at least the deliberation sphere of democracy. Cybernetics then. So one of the scenarios I'm developing in this kind of research agenda is different scenarios of how AI might be used in the future to influence and shape and support democracy. And one of the more extreme forms kind of relates to what I call political cybernetics. And that's the only one I'll be talking briefly about here. I don't have too much time. The cybernetics, I don't know how many are familiar with the term, but I know kind of that that's a good thing about this conference, right? There's biologists and other people here that kind of know these different approaches that aren't that familiar to some of the AI people and to some of the political theorists, for example. But they might be to some of you. Norbert Wiener, for example, wrote about this, right? Cybernetics, control and communication in the animal and the machine. So he talked about using cybernetic as an approach to understand different ways of kind of input translating to outputs and getting feedback mechanisms in order to kind of stabilize and improve the systems running. He also translated that into kind of the human use of human beings and to kind of see kind of how can we use cybernetics to improve society in different ways. And what are the dangers potentially also of doing so, right? And he wrote God and Golem. A lot of his work is quite technical, so for the kind of most political philosophers don't really load these kinds of books. There's a lot of graphs, a lot of formulas, and a lot of mathematics. But people picked up on that in political theory and political science, which takes us into the political sphere, because Wiener didn't really want to kind of make a political theory of cybernetics. Karl Deutsch, for example, wanted to. He wrote about the nerves of government. So this is a 1966 book, Models of Political Communication and Control, where he uses kind of this theory of cybernetics as a way to see how can we kind of make political institutions that effectivizes how we communicate and gather feedback and put the feedback mechanisms kind of back into improving the systems and stabilizing the systems. So he makes all these kinds of schematics and forms to kind of how can we use this kind of foreign input, the domestic input, screen of selective attention, and all these kinds of processes that he tried to kind of see how can we model politics in a way that we can kind of automate and make this kind of complete understanding and also more mathematical and more formal understanding of what we're really doing. We have selective recall, selective memory, tentative decisions, and all these kinds of things here. It's really fun reading these books, and it's also kind of a way to see kind of people are talking about politics and democracy in a way very different from, for example, those emphasizing the role of deliberation and participation in political life. Same with David Easton, systems analysis of political life. How does it come about that any type of system can persist at all, even under the pressures of frequent or constant crisis? He made a lot of complex figures, but also some simpler ones, right? Where we also always have this kind of feedback loop, which is a crucial one for the cybernetics, where we have demands and support, we have political systems, we make decisions and actions, and how to kind of effectively make sure that we monitor the outputs and turn them into kind of relevant feedback for improving the system. So that's kind of the basic idea for all of these people. So let's then skip to AI, because these are all kind of old things, right? But now we're in a different age. We're in the age of AI, age of big data, age of kind of a world where informatics and computer systems are doing a lot more. Very large efficiency gains in the handling of information. The cost of storing a unit of information and processing it at a given location have declined by a factor of 100 million. The cost of transmitting a unit of information long distances has declined by a factor of 1 million and continues to decline. Larger amount of quantitative data, the data movement, It codes incoming information, recognizes patterns, stores, learns from memory, and applies stored information to problem solving and decision making. And then, is it possible to reproduce through computer simulation much of the complexity of a whole society going through processes of change? So this is how we're thinking about data and computing and progress in that area today. But these are the dates for these quotes, right? 1962, 1974, 74, 74, 66, 69. This is old. This is what we think is today, right? We think this all the time. We're living in this cutting edge era where everything is happening so fast. Everything is new. There's new possibilities in computing and doing these sorts of things. But it's not really. It's old in terms of these ideas and what we can do. Yes, we have more compute now. Yes, we have more data. They thought the same, right? But still, things are happening. So there is something interesting here. But I think it's really interesting and fun going back to these people. They thought exactly the same almost at that age. Then we get AI winters, and we got this disappointment about this agenda, and it's returned. With a vengeance, some might say. To do this, finding the solutions to political problems, we must build a miniature world, a mathematical model of the real one, inside a computer, and test various solutions on this world instead of the real one. So this is also one way, right? Making these digital twins and making sure that we can simulate stuff in order to really effectively capture all relevant data and also run simulations on how to best optimize the system. 51 World, for example, creates a digital twin of the entire city of Shanghai. And it's really marketable these days. A lot of cities and municipalities are buying digital twins now because they want to have this digital twin of political life that datafies everything that's relevant and enables us to collect relevant data and test policies and test actions and effectively steer and guide systems. This was 1967 again, and this is now, right? So this thought, this idea is really, really old again. But this is a 2020 article, I think, yes. So this is one of the articles of mine on a shallow defense of the technocracy of artificial intelligence, where I examined the political harms of algorithmic governance in the domain of government. I call it a shallow defense, and not everyone has picked up on that. So some people think I'm actually defending a technocracy of AI, which is fun, because that leads to interesting discussions. But this is a play on Arnes's distinction between the shallow and the deep approaches to this. So this is more of a polemical test, a polemical challenge to proponents of democracy. Why should we not want this sort of technocracy? Which is what I wanted to do with the article. In that sense, it's been successful. And this builds on the premise that AI can now do so much, which we've seen in the preceding days as well, right? It's conquered chess a long time ago. It's conquered Go. You have AlphaFold that does molecules. And it also does more complex games now, like StarCraft and other sorts of games, right? So these systems excel at making and optimizing decision-making in really, really complex systems. Even open systems at times, which is more of this StarCraft-ish and other sorts of games that are beyond the very closed and static games of Go and chess, for example. So it's doing that. It excels as making good decisions in complex situations. So why not then take it into politics? Salesforce AI, for example, a couple of years ago released the AI Economist, which is said to improve equality and productivity with AI-driven tax policies. So this is based on simulations, right? By dynamically having an AI system adjust tax policies, adjust rates and differentiations and distributions of taxes, it made, they claim, better decisions. So this solution made better policies than human beings. Less transparent, perhaps, less understandable, perhaps, but still outcomes where they argued better. Because it could react, it could analyze, it could do a lot of stuff that's different from what humans could do. And they also said that these kinds of systems are harder to game, to strategically navigate, than static human systems, for example. So why not use these systems to make infrastructure decisions, to plan where roads and infrastructure should go, to plan climate change policies, how to mitigate and adapt to climate change, notoriously difficult. AI can help us both identify successful policies, potentially then also implement them if we want to overcome the short-termness of human politics. Corona, pandemic policies, these sorts of things, perhaps we could outsource some of the decision making to AI systems that are good at identifying effective policies in complex spaces. So that's kind of the key question there. So why should we not, would be the question. Why should we not do this? An obvious answer would be, but these are all political choices, right? But yes, but why does that matter? And kind of why should we not? Kind of providing a really good answer to this would be what I think is interesting. And in the article I draw up, let's do this first. Ellul is one of my favorites. So that's one of the kind of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Ellul are one of the kind of two of the French philosophers I use the most, I think. We can be confident that the final result will be that technique for him, not technology, will assimilate everything to the machine. The ideal for which technique strives is the mechanization of everything it encounters. Let's work on that, and that's kind of part of the fear I'm exploring in that scenario, right, where we use AI to make a political cybernetic system in which the human is no longer really needed. As long as we can be monitored, as long as the system can be kind of guided by AI-driven decision-making, for example, we could have the economic freedom that Friedrich Hayek, for example, said that was much more important than political freedom. So we could live these lives of more abundance with better policies and better decisions without us having to engage in politics at all. Would that be a bad thing? Would be the first question. If you say yes, then I kind of ask why. Why would it be a bad thing for us to use AI if we assume that AI gives us objectively kind of better policies, if we accept that we can have an objectively good policy? So that's where I go into 5 potential objections to the technocracy of AI. 1, people need full political participation in order to be satisfied, in order to be fulfilled. We might believe that we as human beings are political beings. We're not really satisfied by just being economical animals, by just kind of fulfilling our daily lives, going to work, watching TV, and doing that kind of stuff. Some people think that humans need to be involved in governing themselves and their societies to really have a good life. But some disagree. People will not deem a government in which they do not participate to be legitimate, potentially. Computers should not make decisions affecting people's lives and well-being. So these are kind of potential objections, and I get into this. How long do I have? 5 minutes. Good. And I'll get into kind of some of the whys here. Some people say computers should not make decisions affecting people's lives and well-being. Some people say that AI is not transparent and thus not fully amenable to human control, for example, which is a problem for us if we use it to make politics, to do politics. I'm sorry about the colors. Accountability regarding the consequences of political decisions must be clear, and it becomes less clear when AI makes decisions. A lot of people are talking about kind of accountability gaps and kind of responsibility gaps, retribution gaps, all these kinds of gaps in kind of using AI systems to make decisions, for example. But how strong are these objections? Kind of how good are they? And are these objections enough for us to kind of say solidly no to kind of using AI more in the political domain? That's kind of the key question then. How strong are they? If objection 1 and 2 are true, AI technocracy is undermined. I can put them up, sorry. So it's there. People need full political participation, and they will not deem a government in which they do not participate to be legitimate. But then considerable disagreement regarding the strength of these objections. Yes, Aristotle thinks we are political animals that need politics. Friedrich Hayek does not. He thinks we are economic animals. If you have economic freedom, and if that's guaranteed by a good constitution and good rule of law, all these kinds of things that are the liberal part of democracy, right? So he emphasizes that. Then it's fine. We don't need to do politics, he says, as long as it's secured by some mechanism. So this is kind of, yes, you might think, you might believe, it might be your opinion that we need that, but not all agree that politics is necessary to live a good life. And fewer people are taking active part in politics in any meaningful way as well. So if this is true, we are already, long before AI, on a path that's kind of taking us far away from the ideal of humans being political animals. Participation can, in theory, arguably also be preserved and perhaps even strengthened and revitalized, right? Because digital technologies allows for a lot more potential direct forms of participation in politics. Voting, inputting into the algorithms, kind of having your voice heard directly, that becomes much easier, some would say, if we do these kinds of politics and do these kinds of digital political systems. Objection number 3, if you say that no AI should be used in any area where human or broader well-being is accepted, is kind of affected, if it makes decisions of moral value, and this is an impossible objection, I would say. This implication appears to be absurd in the sense that almost all uses of AI today, in self-driving cars, in autonomous systems, in kind of automating loan applications, all the ways we already use AI, is clearly kind of decisions of moral value and moral import. They have welfare implications. So if we seriously believe that this objection stops the technocracy of AI, it would stop a whole lot more in that sense. So that's kind of an interesting approach. For me, it's a kind of, we need to accept, and we already accept, that AI systems make decisions, or we outsource decisions to AI systems that has moral implications and value. So in theory, that's not kind of a strong enough objection, I say. We have transparency and accountability. But the feedback loop here is what's important in the cybernetic approach here. Because how do we conceive the nature of feedback if we do the kind of technocracy, the AI, the kind of political cybernetics of AI? Is it enough for us, for example, to collect data on individuals' preferences and actions and beliefs and actions, and use that as new input for systems kind of adjustment? Or do we need participatory processes in which individuals express their experiences, values, desires, and deliberate? Because being monitored in this kind of political cybernetic systems might mean that kind of your interests are taken account of, but you're not really involved in politics as a process. You're not really developing. You're not really taking others' perspectives and taking part in their lives and kind of doing that uncomfortable meeting with other people. Non-transparency is partly a universal problem associated with letting the most knowledgeable make decisions, some say. So Ellul and Langdon Winner and those people have said a kind of, but kind of the complexity of modern society is already beyond kind of before AI made sure that the political system is not really transparent to most people. And there are many reasons to that, and that's kind of discussed and developed in the article further. And what demands on transparency are we willing to set? Because we can get more transparency, but then we need to accept a cost inefficiency in this system. So that's kind of an interesting trade-off as well. And there are different types of opacity. But finally, accountability. We could do forms of kind of accountability for machine actions. Some speak of it being impossible or difficult to say that AI systems kind of have accountability. But I'd say in other articles that it's quite easy. And here I use kind of a Hobbesian account of kind of accountability and what a person is and what delegation is. To kind of say that it is usually quite easy to say that it's possible to draw these systems back to human actors that develop them, deploy them, allow them in some sense. I think these are not magical systems in any way. So I think this kind of accountability part, yes, it might be a bit difficult sometimes, but it's always possible. There are no real gaps in accountability and responsibility with these systems. Let's just stop there then. Thank you.
So I would have a couple of questions or thoughts. One would be just simply starting sort of chronologically, your discussion about criticisms of democracy. One of them that you didn't mention, and I think is interesting to talk about, is the fact that the future generations are not represented here today. And I think people like Edmund Burke or others who've written about sort of shortcomings of democracy would say that also past generations are not represented. I think it's sort of interesting to think of the US Supreme Court as sort of bringing the past to the present. The way I resume kind of your talk would be to say that, well, part of your talk is in terms of using digital twins. And, you know, should you have sort of digital twins of citizens, which I think is an interesting idea. From that to sort of necessarily sort of aggregating that into sort of AI making better decisions and whatever, I think that sort of raises the question of really what is better. And so I think that's a very tough question. You made the argument right at the end that we already accept that some decisions from AI are moral, that we allow AI to make moral decisions. The only one that I can think of is really self-driving cars, and we're not really there yet, in the sense that you could have cars that run over people and so forth. Military applications I don't know much about, I'd be interested to hear more about. But my sense is that generally we have not crossed that threshold where we allow AI to make moral decisions. I'd be curious to hear more arguments as to how we've effectively allowed that to happen already. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, I totally agree on kind of why the first one and why is it better, and I agree because part of the agenda with that is to say that kind of politics and democracy is not about outcomes. There is no kind of objectively good outcome or policy. It's about the process, and I kind of talk in favor of that kind of human chaos and human unpredictability and the kind of process that people go through and learn. I think that's kind of how we should evaluate politics. So I totally agree on that point. That probably didn't come across here because this was more premised on kind of these are the kinds of thoughts that I think a lot of the proponents of using AI are building on. That they say that they believe we can find objectively good policies. In terms of the second one, I think, for example, kind of granting bank loans and credit rates and all that kind of thing, I think that is kind of a moral decision. In terms of using AI system for kind of grouping welfare recipients, kind of pre-evaluating applications for those kinds of things, I think it has moral implications. I think these are moral decisions in a sense. But also clearly in military applications. But there you can say that but we as a world society or we as France or we as someone else don't allow it, right? But someone does. But that might be controversial, so you say that, but that's controversial. We don't accept that, right? But also in self-driving cars, I agree. But I think a lot of the implications are potentially kind of small negative value. So we kind of accept it in the cases where we think the kind of damage and risks are relatively small. But I say that kind of in terms of having an absolute threshold to say that it should not have any moral value, this decision. I think we're far past that. But we might say that kind of seriously affects people's lives, for example. There we might kind of argue that you think not, I think they do. But I think we're kind of at least getting closer in more and more areas then. And I think there are a lot of cases already where they have at least some moral significance. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. So I'm a biologist, so this is really not my field. So I just wanted to say that, okay, I mean, maybe with time, I mean, we will get more and more dependent on AI for political decisions. And that might be fine for a while. But then, let's say there would be a problem, like no electricity, or somebody found that there is a virus and the program didn't work as it was supposed to be. Yeah. Or maybe it's a very big decision to take, and we know that the population is very divided. And so then the acceptance will not work. I mean, it will not, the decision will not be accepted. So this means that we always need to be able to do it without AI. I mean, and this was a discussion we had yesterday. I mean, just in case something goes wrong, we need not to be dependent. So we need to have ways to be able to do it without it. So what do you think of this? And,
yes, I write about, yes, I totally agree. And I write about that in the article as one of the preconditions, if we were to accept this, is that we kind of erect a system of kind of a backup, a human-run backup. And I say that that's almost impossible. If we are to have the full benefit of the most advanced AI systems in politics, it will be impossible for us to run this kind of parallel system where we keep the kind of political and democratic muscles of people kind of alive enough to take over should they fail. So that's an argument I make in the article. I think that's a really, really strong argument because we are really kind of then very, very much dependent on these systems functioning properly. And another one I would say, and related one, is that I think it relates to kind of this intellectual atrophy or kind of political atrophy, perhaps, of kind of people who haven't really for ages then been involved in making political decisions or engaging in political activity. I think that might just be really, really difficult if we kind of stop doing it for a while and then kind of suddenly think that we can just restart doing it. I think that's a kind of something that takes practice and takes continual practice, potentially. So I totally agree. Yeah.
Questions lined up and
yeah, thank you very much for fascinating talk. I've not heard you that much, I think, unless I missed something, talk about autonomy. And this is one of the principles, for example, for bioethics, but has been proposed to be included in the questions of ethics about AI at the European level. So if we consider that preserving the autonomy of citizens is a value, desired value, then might this contribute as one of the arguments?
Yes. And I think that runs a bit kind of into the same objections as the ones about us having to be involved in political activity to be autonomous. Because a lot of people, I think, would say that we might kind of make this justification of if we erect this system where rule of law is really strongly kind of upheld and people agree on and support this kind of system, then and perhaps once, perhaps occasionally, just kind of by kind of validating that system, for example, and they have full autonomy or even more autonomy in all the other spheres of life, I think we could still say that they are meaningfully autonomous beings, even if they don't run the government very directly. So I think at least there's arguments to be made there, that people aren't necessarily not autonomous, even if we have less direct involvement in politics. But that's clearly one of the arguments based on this kind of democracy as self-government and agency. So I think it doesn't really, it's not a strong enough argument for everyone. And that's kind of what I'm looking at, because you said this has foundational moral value. And if I did that at the outset of the article, and I said, for example, to me, autonomy means this, and I mean that this has foundational moral value, then I could say it, so therefore technocracy doesn't work, right? I'm more in the sense that I need some kind of consensus in terms of kind of finding a basis for objections that everyone, or at least most, would agree to, regardless of my opinion on this, or your opinion on autonomy, for example, right? So it's a different sort of agenda, I think, and I think it would be possible, certainly, to say that kind of my conception of autonomy means that we need to be democratically involved, so this. But if that doesn't kind of convince people, then it's not that interesting an argument, in a sense. Yeah.
My question is about objectivity. I've seen that you've mentioned Jacques Ellul as a philosopher of technologies, but I was thinking about the work of Peter Paul Verberg or Mark Hockenberg about the fact that values are embedded in AI systems. So if we assume that it is true that these systems are not neutral, how do we take this into account?
Yes, I totally agree. And that takes us to the fourth level, I think, with kind of the power of big corporations and kind of citizens beyond political and democratic control. So that's very much part of it. And the article I showed is written with Mark Hockenberg. And now I'm writing a book with Langdon Winner, who wrote the book, Do Artifacts Have Politics, right? So he's kind of one of those that said that technology is never neutral. There's always some value here, and there's always some kind of moral implications of using technologies. So that's one of the objections I use as well. You won't be able to kind of bracket all those kinds of interests and decisions made by the developers of those who kind of gather data, decide what data to gather, how to code it, how to process it, all those kinds of processes that would need to be done before this kind of becomes the political systems that we recognize are done by people beyond democratic control. So I certainly think that's a huge weakness with kind of accepting the idea that this is a neutral technology that we can use for making objectively good policies. So again, I agree that this is one of the good objections to it. But then, of course, we need that kind of accountability debate.
If the system embedded one person's specific values as a digital twin, then maybe that issue wouldn't come up, right?
Also, but the digital twin could never be perfect, right? It could never have 100% fidelity to you. So someone would decide kind of what aspects of you would be represented in the digital twin, for example. So there are always these kinds of decisions that has value and implications. What data points about you would be represented in a digital twin? How would we quantify it? How would we do all that kind of thing? And how would we aggregate and analyze and process that information? I think all of these choices would still be political and sort of hidden in these sorts of systems. Even if we tried for maximum fidelity, there's no way we could make, at least in kind of the foreseeable future, a perfect digital twin representing the full breadth of human experience, for example. So if you do the phenomenological approach as well as the mechanism, for example, kind of having all of what it means to be you represented in a digital twin, and then unmediated, having that translated into the political process, I think that's kind of beyond computational systems as we know them now, at least. So I think that's a kind of insurmountable objection in a sense. We would need to limit them, we would need to kind of be clear on who makes these systems, how do they make it, how do we document it, and how can we be democratically involved in, for example, these choices? Because that's the democratic governance of AI, of course, which is also part of what we write about. Because we could say that, yes, all choices related to technologies have political consequences, so let's make sure that we are democratically involved in making these choices, and that we have public deliberations about how we want AI to be made and to be used. So that's one way, of course, to kind of try to address these issues. But we can never get there fully, I think.
Yes, David Chavalarias, a few short remarks. So first, when you talk about the opposition between the voting system and Schumpeter and Habermas, this is based on all voting systems. So now you have more modern voting systems that allow better aggregation of the preferences, etc. So also we can have this discussion. The second is that, so you mentioned Wiener, you could also mention von Foster. And if you mention Foster, then there's all this nice work of Jean-Pierre Dupuis about von Foster conjecture that shows that if you add a correlation between people, for example, with AI systems, then you increase the alienation and you reduce autonomy. So in that case, I mean, having a pure AI government or things like that is increasing alienation for people, not freedom. But what I want to insist in is, so imagine you have, so first, there is no generic AI that can optimize, but let's say that we have one. I make a recall of what we discussed with the question of subjectivity. The thing is that every time you take some public decisions, public policies that impact the people, potentially you will change their preferences and subjectivity. So in what you say, it seems that preferences are fixed. If you assume that preferences are not fixed and depend on the context and the policy, etc., then this means that every time an AI will take a decision, it will change also the way people will feel about this decision. This means that taking a decision in such systems leads to multiple equilibria. So this means that, and with different level of welfare, if you measure welfare, if there was a way to measure it. This means that your AI systems will have to choose between multiple equilibria with no criteria to choose between them. So you will have to put your criteria. This means that you will have a policy that choose how the AI will choose among the different equilibria. And so we come back to the beginning, because how you select the equilibria. So there is like a circular things here.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's really interesting as well. And that's part of this conflict, I guess, also between kind of the competitive view of democracy as an irrational choice approach also to kind of politics in general, that is having fixed preferences, assuming that people's preferences are fixed, versus, for example, the deliberative democracy, which explicitly, and participatory democracy, which explicitly states that just being part of politics changes preferences. But that's a different sort of thing, right? Because you're talking about kind of having a preference at one point in time, making a decision, and then preferences change. I think that could be part of a kind of feedback process as well, right? So we get closer and closer to kind of, we make decisions based on the preferences at the point of the decision being made. And then, of course, we need feedback in terms of how do preferences change? How do people really like this? And how does people adjust and react to this? And then we kind of have a continual process, I think these people would say. But I agree that it's difficult to say that we can have an objectively good policy outcome based on one kind of, one section of preferences from one point in time. So I don't think they can fix that, but I think a lot of kind of the cybernetic ideal would say that, okay, but these are fluctuations. So whenever a decision is made, we get fluctuations, and then we need to feed that back in the system so we can adjust. And at one point reach this. I would think, I'm not sure.